The plane touched down with a soft jolt, but the man in the window seat, Robert, didn't stir from his thoughts. Outside, the gray sky promised rain. A week early, he'd finished the negotiations in Hong Kong in half the time, a brutal efficiency that usually filled him with a sharp, clean pride. Today, it just felt empty. His phone buzzed as the taxi merged into the city traffic. His business partner, Olivia, was already messaging about the next quarter, about a potential merger in Frankfurt. The words blurred together. He looked out at the streets, at the people hurrying home. Where was home, really? For him, it was a penthouse apartment on the 42nd floor, a place of quiet corners and perfect views, a place to sleep, to think, to prepare for the next day, not a place to live. The elevator ride up was a silent glide. He pushed the heavy door open and the familiar, tomb-like silence greeted him. The air smelled of lemon polish and nothing else. Everything was in its place, the abstract sculpture on the pedestal, the magazines fanned perfectly on the glass table, the deep carpet without a single footprint. He dropped his suitcase by the door. The sound too loud. "Elara," he called out, more out of habit than expectation. His housekeeper usually finished by 3. It was past 5. She must have left. He walked to the kitchen, thinking of pouring a drink, but stopped. There was a sound, faint, but there. Not the hum of the refrigerator or the whisper of the air conditioning. This was a different sound, a soft, rhythmic swishing. It was coming from the west wing. A prickle, not of alarm, but of pure curiosity, went up his spine. The west wing held his bedroom, a private study he never used, and the other room, the one he hadn't set foot in for years. He moved down the hallway, his expensive shoes silent on the floor. The sound grew clearer, a soft tap, then a longer brush, and a faint, almost inaudible hum. Someone was definitely in there. His first, fleeting thought was an intruder, but it was too rhythmic, too purposeful for a thief. He stood before the tall, oak door. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of warm, yellow light cutting across the dark hallway floor. This was wrong. This door was always shut, always locked, in his mind if not with a key. He pushed it open, slowly. The sight that met him was so profoundly disorienting that for a full 10 seconds, his brain refused to make sense of it. The room was bathed in the golden, late afternoon light streaming through the large, north-facing windows he'd had specially installed a lifetime ago. But the room he remembered as sterile, empty space meant for a hobby he'd abandoned was gone. It was alive. Canvases, large and small, leaned against every wall. Some were finished, breathtaking explosions of color. Others were just beginnings, sketches of shapes and light. The smell was not of dust, but of oil paint, of turpentine, of creativity itself. In the center of this beautiful chaos, standing with her back to him, was Elara. But it wasn't the Elara he knew. The Elara he knew wore a simple, gray dress, her hair pulled back in a tight, practical bun. She moved through his apartment like a ghost, efficient and silent, her eyes always politely downcast. This Elara stood tall before a large canvas on an easel. She wore an old, paint-splattered shirt over her clothes. Her hair, a rich silver he'd never truly noticed, was loose, falling around her shoulders. And she was painting, not dabbling, painting with the focused, flowing grace of a concert pianist. Her arm swept across the canvas, her wrist flicking with a confidence that spoke of a lifetime of practice. He must have made a sound, a gasp, or perhaps his shadow fell across her light. She froze. The humming stopped. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, slowly. She turned. The transformation on her face was a tragedy in 2 acts. For one beautiful, unguarded moment, he saw her, not his housekeeper, but an artist lost in her work, her eyes bright with the joy of creation. Then, recognition slammed into her. The light in her eyes extinguished, replaced by a raw, animal terror. Her face went pale. The paintbrush slipped from her fingers, hitting the wooden floor with a sharp, final clack. "Mr. Vance," she whispered, the words choked. Her hands, stained with a kaleidoscope of blues and ochres, flew up to her mouth. I am so sorry. I will go. I will pack now." She moved as if to flee, but seemed rooted to the spot, waiting for his fury. This was, after all, a profound violation. She had used his private space without permission. She had lied, in a way, by hiding this. She had transformed a part of his property into something he did not recognize. Robert said nothing. He couldn't. His eyes were dragged from her stricken face back to the canvas. It was a portrait, nearly finished. It was of an old man who sold flowers from a cart down in the square. Robert passed him every day, never really seeing him. But here, Elara had seen him. She had painted the deep canyons of wrinkles round his eyes not as signs of age, but as maps of a life lived. She had captured the gentle strength in his hands, cradling a bunch of daisies. She had painted the man's dignity. He looked at the other canvases. A young woman, a nurse perhaps, leaning against a bus stop window, her expression one of exhausted compassion. A group of children playing jump rope in a dusty courtyard, their movement so vivid he could almost hear their laughter. This wasn't just talent. This was a soul speaking, and it had been speaking here, in the silence of his empty home, for who knew how long. He started, his own voice sounding strange to him. You did these? Elara simply nodded, her shoulders hunched as if waiting for a blow. She looked small again, like his housekeeper, but he could no longer see her that way. The image of her standing tall at the easel was burned into his mind. He took a step into the room, his eyes scanning the paintings. He stopped before one. It was a smaller piece, simpler. It was a view from a high window, looking down at the city at night. It was his view, but she had painted it not as a cold grid of lights, but as a constellation, a tapestry of warm glows, each one a story. She had painted the loneliness out of it, and found the connected beauty. How long? He asked, not looking at her. 2 years. Her voice was barely a whisper. Sometimes more. When the work was finished and you were away. The light. It is good in here. I am so very sorry. I will clean everything. It will be as it was, he repeated, the words tasting like ash. He finally turned to look at her. The fear in her eyes was a physical pain to see. He was a man who negotiated million-dollar deals, who made hard decisions that affected hundreds of people. But in that moment, he felt utterly out of his depth. This was not a problem to be solved with money or orders. This was a hidden world, a secret life, blooming in the desert of his own. And he had blundered into it like a bull in a china shop. He saw a small, folding stool in the corner. He walked over, the legs scraping softly on the floor. He sat down. He wasn't standing over her anymore. He was just a man in a room full of miracles he didn't understand. Elara, he said, and his tone made her look up. It wasn't angry. It was quiet, bewildered. Please don't clean anything. Just tell me. What is this? He gestured not just to the paintings, but to the act itself, to the secret she had kept so close. She stared at him, confusion now mixing with the fear. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant sigh of the city below. The millionaire was home early, sitting on a cheap stool in his own forgotten studio, waiting for his housekeeper to explain the meaning of the beauty she had created in the dark. And for the first time in a very, very long time, he was listening. The clack of the paintbrush on the floor seemed to echo forever in the sunlit room. Elara stood frozen, a statue of shame and fear. Robert just sat on the little stool, his mind trying to catch up with his eyes. The paintings weren't just good, they were windows, and he had just thrown open the curtain on a life that wasn't his to see. I will pack now, Elara repeated, her voice a dry leaf in the wind. She moved stiffly, like an old machine, to wipe her hands on a rag. The colorful stains on her skin looked like bruises in that moment. Wait, Robert said. The word came out softer than he intended. He held up a hand, not to command, but to ask for a pause. Just wait a moment. He didn't know why he said it. He should have been angry. This was a trespass. But the anger wouldn't come. All he felt was a huge, aching curiosity, and underneath it, a strange sense of guilt, as if he was the one who had been caught somewhere he shouldn't be. He stood up slowly, his eyes leaving her terrified face. He had to look at the paintings again. He had to make sure he hadn't imagined their power. He walked to the portrait of the old flower seller. Up close, the details were even more stunning. He could see every individual brushstroke that built the kindness in the man's eyes. This is Mr. Petrov, he heard himself say. From the square, a tiny, shaky breath came from behind him. You know him? I see him. Every day. The difference between knowing and seeing had never felt so vast. He moved to the painting of the tired nurse. And this. She works at the clinic on Elm Street. She takes the same bus as me, always so tired, always with a book. He looked at a vibrant, chaotic painting of a kitchen. Not his own sleek, stainless steel kitchen. This one was warm, crowded with mismatched dishes, steam rising from a pot, hands chopping vegetables. It buzzed with life and noise he could almost hear. This was my mother's kitchen, Elara's voice whispered, a little stronger now, drawn out by the painting. In my city, before, that one word, before, hung in the air. It explained everything and nothing. Robert turned to face her. She was still standing by her easel, her paint-stained hands clenched together. The initial terror was fading, replaced by a deep, weary resignation. She looked like someone who had lost something precious and was already mourning it. "Why?" he asked, the simplest question. "Why here?" She glanced around the studio, her eyes touching her canvases with a love so palpable it hurt Robert to witness. "Where else?" she said, her shoulders lifting in a small, helpless shrug. "My room is small. The light is bad, and here, this room." She looked at the beautiful, empty windows, the dust motes dancing in the late sun. "You built it for the light, but you never used it." The silence here. It was not an empty silence. It was a full one. A space. She took a shaky breath, deciding something. She walked to a small wooden chest tucked in the corner, a personal item he'd never noticed. From it, she pulled a faded photograph and a small, old booklet. She handed them to him. The photograph showed a younger Alara, her hair dark, standing proudly in front of a classroom. The walls behind her were covered in children's drawings. She was smiling, a confident, open smile he had never seen. The booklet was a teaching certificate from a university in a city whose name he couldn't pronounce. It was worn at the edges. "I was an art teacher," she said, simply. "For 23 years, Robert stared at the proof in his hands. A whole life, condensed into a photo and a document. "What happened?" "The war happened," she said, and her tone was flat, final. It was a door she was not going to open for him, not today. "We left, came here. My papers, my degrees, they were not accepted. My husband, he became sick. The medicine was expensive. Then he was gone." She said it without self-pity, just as facts, one after the other, like stones building a wall. "I needed work. This work was good. It paid for the medicine then. Now it sends money home to my sister. It is an honest living." She took the photograph back from him, her thumb stroking the face of the woman she used to be. "For many years, I did not pick up a brush. My heart was too heavy. It felt like a betrayal of that life, to paint in this new, hard one. But then, one day, I was cleaning this room. The sun was just so on the floor, and I remembered the feeling, the need to put what is inside, outside, to make something from nothing." She looked at him, her eyes glistening now. "It was wrong. I know it was wrong to use your home, your things. I am not asking for forgiveness. I am just explaining." Robert looked from her tired, honest face to the vibrant, living art surrounding them. He thought of his own life, the deals, the contracts, the empty apartment, the silence that was empty. He had built a fortune from nothing, but what had he made? What had he created that spoke of a soul, of a human heart? He walked over to the small sink in the corner, meant for cleaning brushes he'd never used. He turned on the tap, let the water run warm. He found a clean cloth. "Here," he said, holding it out to her. "Your hands." She looked at the cloth, confused. Slowly, she took it and began to wipe the paint from her fingers. The gesture was so ordinary, so domestic, it seemed to break the last of the icy tension. "Would you like some tea?" Robert asked. It was the only thing he could think to say. In the kitchen, the familiar, cold space felt different. He filled the kettle, fumbling with the cups. Alara sat at the breakfast bar, back straight, looking like a guest in the house she had run for 7 years. The silence was thick, but not the usual comfortable silence between employer and employee. This was a new, fragile thing. He placed a cup in front of her. "You don't have to leave," he said, staring into his own tea. She looked up, shocked. "I do not understand." "The room," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the west wing. "It's a good room. The light. You're right. It's good light." He was stumbling over his words. A man used to delivering perfect pitches, now unable to form a simple thought. "It's wasted on me. It's been wasted for years." He met her eyes. What if you didn't have to only paint when the work was done and I was away?" Alara's cup rattled on the saucer as she set it down. "Mr. Vance, I am your housekeeper. This is my job. I'm not asking you to stop being the housekeeper," he said, though even he wasn't sure what he was asking. "I'm just saying, the room is there. The paints are there. You should use them, whenever you want." He saw the conflict warring on her face. Hope, fierce and sudden, fighting with a lifetime of caution and pride. "This is charity. I cannot accept." "It's not charity," he said, a little too sharply. He took a breath. It's a trade. You get the studio, I get." He floundered, looking around. "I get to see the paintings, sometimes, if that's okay." He was a millionaire, a powerful man, and he was bargaining for the right to look at his own employees' artwork. The absurdity of it almost made him laugh, but it felt like the most important deal he'd ever made. Elara studied him for a long time. She was seeing him, too, perhaps for the first time, not just as the boss, the busy man who left early and came home late, but as a person, sitting in his quiet kitchen, making a clumsy, awkward offer. A single tear escaped, tracing a line down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, with the heel of her hand. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. The portrait of Mr. Petrov, she said finally, her voice thick. It is for him, for his birthday next week. He does not know. His daughter asked me. She sees me sketching sometimes in the square. She paid me a little for the materials. Robert felt a lump in his throat. This was her real work, not cleaning his floors, but capturing souls for the people who loved them. Then you have to finish it, he said simply. He stood up, taking his barely touched tea to the sink. He needed to give her space, to let this impossible new reality settle. I have some calls to make. In my study. He paused at the kitchen doorway. Don't clean tomorrow, just paint. He walked away, leaving her sitting at the counter, surrounded by the gleaming, lifeless surfaces of his kitchen, her world quietly turning inside out. Back in his study, he didn't make any calls. He sat in his leather chair, looking out at the city lights beginning to sparkle in the dusk. He thought about the painting of this very view, the one she had made warm and full of stories. For the first time, he wondered what stories his own light told, and to whom. And he realized, with a jolt, that he didn't want to be just a viewer anymore. He wanted to be a part of one. The next morning, the apartment didn't just feel quiet, it felt different. Like the air itself was holding its breath. Robert woke at his usual time, but instead of diving straight into emails, he found himself listening. He heard the soft, distant sounds from the West Wing, not the vacuum cleaner, but the gentle scrape of a stool, the soft tap of a brush against a glass jar. He made coffee, the rich smell filling the sterile kitchen. He poured 2 cups, hesitated, then carried one down the hallway. The studio door was open. Elara was there, already working on Mr. Petrov's portrait, adding tiny highlights to the flowers in his cart. She wore her paint shirt again. She looked up, her body tensing for a second, the old habit of being caught. Then she saw the coffee in his hand. Her shoulders relaxed, just a little. I thought you might need this, Robert said, his voice sounding too loud in the creative hush. Thank you, she said, taking the mug, her fingers, already smudged with green and yellow, wrapped around it. It is almost finished. The light is perfect now. For the final touches, he didn't leave. He stood there, sipping his coffee, watching her work. It wasn't a stare of inspection, but of pure fascination. He saw how she mixed a color, testing it, on the edge of her palette, how she stood back, head tilted, seeing not just what was there, but what she wanted to bring out. It's the eyes, isn't it? He said after a while. That's what makes it feel alive. She nodded, not looking away from the canvas. The eyes are the window, but the hands are the story. Mr. Petrov's hands have held so many flowers, so much life. They are gentle, but strong, like him. Robert looked at his own hands, holding the coffee cup. They were smooth, manicured. They signed papers, shook deals into existence. What story did they tell? He came back that afternoon, and the next morning, it became a new, quiet rhythm. He would bring coffee. He would ask a simple question. Why that color there? Or how do you know when it's done? At first, her answers were short, polite, but slowly, as she saw his interest was real, not just politeness, she began to explain. She talked about light and shadow, about composition, about capturing a feeling, not just a face. She spoke about her old students, her voice warming with the memory. One afternoon, he was watching her start a new painting, just the first rough shapes in charcoal on a fresh canvas. It was of a young man who worked at the grocery store, a boy with a bright smile who always helped her with her bags. You know, Robert said, leaning against the doorframe, I used to take photographs a long time ago, before all this. He gestured, vaguely, meaning the business, the money, the whole life he had built. Elara paused, the charcoal stick in her hand. What did you photograph? People on the street. Just moments. He hadn't thought about it in years. I had a darkroom and everything. I thought maybe I could be good at it. Then I got my first real job, and it just stopped. She looked at him, really looked at him. Why did it stop? The question was so simple, but it hit him like a punch. It didn't seem important, he said, and the truth of it tasted bitter. It didn't make money. It was just a thing I did. She turned back to the canvas, sketching a strong, confident line for the boy's shoulder. Making money is important to live, but making something from your heart, that is important too, to feel alive. Her words sat with him for the rest of the day. He was in his study, trying to read a contract, but the words blurred. He kept thinking about his old camera, stored somewhere in a closet. He thought about the difference between taking a picture and making a painting. One captured a moment. The other, it seemed, tried to capture the soul inside it. A week later, he came home with a large, flat paper bag. He found Alara in the studio, cleaning her brushes. The portrait of Mr. Petrov was finished, wrapped carefully in brown paper, ready for its journey. "I got you something," Robert said, feeling oddly shy. He pulled out a set of professional-grade oil paints, the kind in rich, metal tubes. Then a bundle of brushes, their hairs soft and fine. "The ones you have are getting worn." Alara touched the tubes of paint with reverence. These were not the student-grade supplies she rationed carefully. These were the tools of a master. Her eyes glistened. "This is too much." "It's not," he said firmly. "It's just the right tools for the job." He wasn't her boss giving a gift. He was a student bringing supplies for his teacher. That evening, over a simple meal, they shared in the kitchen a new habit, one that started when he asked her about the food in her paintings. She said, "I have been thinking of a new project, a series." "Tell me," he said, pushing his plate aside. "Hands," she said, holding up her own. "I want to paint only hands, the hands of people who are unseen. The woman who fixes the elevators, the man who washes the windows on these tall buildings, the hands that hold the city together, but that no one really sees." Robert felt a spark ignite in his own chest, a feeling he hadn't had since his earliest, most exciting business ideas. But this was different. This wasn't about profit, it was about purpose. "That's brilliant," he said. "We should do it." She raised an eyebrow. Let me help," he said, the words tumbling out. "I can arrange it. I can talk to people, get them to sit for you. I can be your assistant." The idea was laughable. Him, the millionaire, assisted to his housekeeper. But it felt more right than anything he'd done in years. The next day, he put on a simple jacket and went down to the building's maintenance office. He knew the superintendent, a gruff man in his 60s. Robert had only ever spoken to him about complaints. "John," Robert said, extending his hand. "I have a strange request." He explained the project, not as a boss giving an order, but as a man asking for a favor. He talked about Alara, not as his employee, but as an artist. He saw the skepticism on John's face melt into curiosity, then into a kind of proud surprise. "You want to paint old Mike's hands," John said, scratching his head. "From the boiler room? They're rougher than sandpaper." "Exactly," Robert smiled. "That's what we want to see." Mike was shy, uncomfortable at first, sitting in the studio's light on a simple wooden chair. But Alara talked to him, asked him about his work, about the old heating system he tended like a baby. As she spoke, she sketched. And as she sketched, Mike relaxed, his rough, capable hands resting on his knees, telling their own story of decades of hard, honest labor. Robert didn't interrupt. He watched. He made tea. He moved a light when she asked. He saw the portrait. A merge, not just hands, but a lifetime of keeping others warm. Word began to spread. In a quiet way, Robert asked the head of security, a former police officer with calm, observant hands, if he would sit. He did. He asked the elderly woman who came on Tuesdays to water the plants in the lobby. She agreed, her hands thin and veined, but still strong from nurturing growing things. The studio was no longer just Alara's secret sanctuary. It became a quiet, purposeful hub. People came in, nervous at first, then left feeling somehow seen, honored. Robert was the bridge. He used his confidence, his way of talking to people, but for a completely new reason. Not to close a deal, but to open a door. One evening, his business partner Olivia called. "We need to talk about the Frankfurt merger documents. You've been distant. I've been here," Robert said, looking from his study doorway toward the warm light spilling from the studio. "That's not what I mean." Olivia's voice was sharp. "You're missing calls. You're not focused. What is going on over there?" "Something important," Robert said, and he meant it. There was a pause. "Is this about that charity thing, the community center donation?" "We can handle that with a check, Robert. You don't need to get personally involved. It's not about a check," he said, his voice firmer than he intended. "It's about people. It's about creating something real." Olivia sighed, the sound full of static and impatience. "People are a liability. Sentiment is a weakness. Don't lose sight of what built all this, Robert. Don't get soft. After he hung up, her words echoed in the quiet study. Soft. He looked at his own hands. For the first time, he wondered if being hard was all there was. He thought of the strength in Mike the boiler man's hands, a strength that served, that maintained. He thought of the gentle strength in Alara's hands as they held a brush, creating beauty from memory and feeling. He wasn't getting soft, he was, for the first time in a very long time, feeling the edges of his own humanity. And it didn't feel like a weakness. It felt like waking up from a long, cold sleep. The studio light beckoned, and he went toward it, leaving the shadow of the deal behind. The rhythm of the studio became the new heartbeat of the apartment. Robert found himself planning his days around it. Mornings were for business, afternoons were for the project. The series, The Hands That Hold Us, was growing. They had 5 portraits now, each more powerful than the last. The studio walls were a gallery of quiet dignity. But outside those walls, the old world was tightening its grip. Olivia's call was just the beginning. The Frankfurt merger, the one he'd been putting off, was now critical. The other company was getting impatient. Emails turned red with urgency. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from lawyers and bankers. The pressure was a familiar cage, and part of him knew how to step right back inside. One afternoon, he was in the studio, watching Alara work on the hands of the building's head of security. She was capturing the calm, deliberate strength in them. Robert's phone vibrated on the stool beside him for the 10th time. He glanced at it. Olivia, again. I have to take this, he muttered, his voice sounding like an intrusion. He stepped out into the hallway. Olivia, I said I'd look at the papers tonight. Tonight is too late. Her voice was a whip crack. They're in my office now. They want the principal, Robert, not a ghost. This is a 9-figure deal. Your focus needs to be here, not on whatever hobby you've picked up. He pinched the bridge of his nose. It's not a hobby. Then what is it? The question was a challenge. Before he could find an answer, a sound from the studio made him turn. A soft, pained gasp. He ended the call abruptly. I'll call you back. Inside, Ilara was sitting on her stool, not looking at the canvas. She was staring at her own phone, her face ashen. The brush lay forgotten in her lap. What is it? Robert asked, the merger instantly forgotten. It is my sister, Ilara whispered. Back home. She has been ill for months. The doctor's there. They say she needs a special treatment. In the capital, she looked up at him, her eyes wide with a fear he recognized, the fear of powerlessness. The cost, it is more than I can ever have. Let me help, he started immediately. No, the word was firm, absolute. It was the pride of a woman who had lost everything but her self-respect. This is my family, my responsibility. I will manage. How? Robert asked gently. She looked around the studio, her gaze landing on the finished portrait of Mr. Petrov, still wrapped and leaning against the wall. Then her eyes swept over the other canvases. I will sell them, she said, her voice hollow. I will sell them all, quickly. It will be enough for a start. The thought was a physical blow to Robert. Sell them? These pieces of soul, these stories, pawned off in a panic to anyone with a few dollars? It felt like a tragedy. Ilara, you can't just sell them to the first person. Their value, what value? She asked, a sudden sharpness in her tone. They are paintings by an old woman, an immigrant housekeeper. Who will pay for that? I will price them low. Someone will buy them for their walls. The money is what matters now. She stood up, moving with a frantic energy, starting to gather finished canvases. The security guard's unfinished hands watched from the easel, a silent plea. Robert stood there, trapped between two collapsing worlds. In one, a multi-million-dollar deal that demanded his cold, full attention. In the other, a human crisis that demanded his heart. Olivia's words echoed. Don't get soft. Sentiment is a weakness. But looking at Ilara, at the way her hands trembled as she touched the edge of her painting of the old flower seller, he knew that wasn't true. Sentiment, compassion, connection wasn't the opposite of strength. It was the reason for it. What was the point of all his power, all his money, if he couldn't use it to do one right thing? A strange calm settled over him. The chaos of the merger, the panic in the studio, it all narrowed into a single, clear path. He knew what he had to do. Not as a boss, not as a patron, as a friend. Stop, he said, his voice quiet but leaving no room for argument. Put them down, please. She stopped, her arms wrapped around a canvas. Trust me, he said, for 24 hours. Do not sell anything. Let me make 2 calls. She searched his face, seeing not the millionaire, But the man who had sat silently for hours watching her work, slowly, she nodded. The first call he made from his study, with the door closed, he called his personal lawyer. I need you to find the best private medical coordinator for Eastern European treatments. Find a top specialist. Arrange everything for a patient from this city. He gave the sisters details. Cover all costs. Set up a direct channel. I don't want her to know the source. Make it look like a charitable medical grant. Do it now. The lawyer, used to strange requests from the wealthy, asked no questions. It will be done. The second call was to Olivia. He didn't go to her office. He called her. I'm out, he said. The moment she answered, out of where? The meeting is out of the merger, Robert said, his voice even. I'm not signing. You can buy me out. You can take the lead. I don't care. My focus is elsewhere. The silence on the other end was volcanic. You are throwing away a fortune. For what? For your maid's art project. The contempt in her voice was searing. You will never understand what it is, Robert said, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders so profound he almost swayed. So, this is where we part ways. Handle the fallout. He hung up before she could reply. He felt the consequences looming, the financial hit, the professional gossip, the whispering that he'd lost his edge. He felt absolutely free. The next part required a different skill. He spent the evening on the phone, not with bankers, but with a different part of his network. An old college friend who ran a small, respected gallery downtown. A woman he knew from a charity board who wrote for the culture section of the newspaper. He called in favors, but not for himself. He pitched the story, not of a millionaire, but of an undiscovered artist and her tribute to the invisible workforce of the city. 3 days later, Elara stood in a clean, white-walled gallery downtown. Her paintings, the hands of the boiler man, the security guard, the window washer, the elevator technician, the old flower seller were hung under soft, perfect lights. A small, tasteful sign read, "The hands that hold us, portraits by Elara." She was wearing a simple black dress, one Robert had insisted on buying, not as a uniform, but as armor. Tonight, you are not the housekeeper. You are the artist. He had told her. She was terrified. No one will come. People came. Robert had invited the subjects of the paintings and their families. They arrived first, their eyes wide with wonder, pointing, laughing with pride. The old flower seller, Mr. Petrov, stood before his own portrait with his daughter, tears rolling into his smile. Then, others filtered in the gallery's usual crowd, art lovers, a few curious critics. Robert stayed in the background, a glass of water in his hand, watching her. He saw the moment a serious-looking woman with a notebook engaged Elara in conversation. He saw Elara's initial fear melt as she began to talk about her work, about the people in the paintings. Her hands moved as she spoke, her eyes alight. She was not the shy woman from his kitchen. She was the confident teacher from the photograph, returned. The critic listened, nodded, asked thoughtful questions. After a long while, she touched Elara's arm gently. These are exceptional. They have a profound humanity. What's next for you? Elara, flushed with a joy Robert had never seen in her, looked across the room. She found him and gave him a small, overwhelmed smile. He nodded back, a lump in his throat. In that moment, his phone buzzed. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. He slipped into the gallery's back hallway. It was Olivia, and a string of messages from the merger lawyers. The headline was clear. The deal had collapsed without him. The fallout was beginning. He was losing real money. By the minute, he leaned against the cool wall. He could see Elara through the doorway, surrounded by people, shining. He heard the murmur of appreciative voices, saw the faces of the window washer's children looking up at their father's painted hands with awe. He looked at the angry messages on his screen, then back at the light in the gallery. The choice was no longer a choice at all. He silenced his phone and walked back into the light to join his friend. The quiet after the gallery show was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the empty silence of the penthouse before. It was a peaceful, tired quiet, full of the echo of good things. Elara's paintings had all sold, not for a fortune, but for real money, enough to surprise her and give her a security she'd never known. More importantly, the critic's review came out 2 days later. It was short but powerful. It called her work a vital, human antidote to a cold world, and asked, "Who is this artist? And where has she been?" Robert read the review online in his study. He felt a pride so fierce it surprised him. Then he opened the other tabs on his browser. The financial news. The headlines were less kind. Vance's retreat raises eyebrows. Merger collapse leaves questions. His phone now permanently on silent, still lit up with messages from worried investors, angry former partners, and Olivia, whose last text had been a single, icy word, fool. He closed the laptop. The predicted storm had arrived. He had lost a significant chunk of his wealth. At least on paper, his reputation as an unshakable dealmaker was cracked. Strangely, the feeling in his chest wasn't panic. It was relief. It was the relief of a man who had been carrying a heavy, ornate vase for miles, finally setting it down, even if it meant hearing it crack. He found Alara in the studio. She was not painting. She was sitting, staring at the bank statement in her hands, her brow furrowed. "It doesn't feel real," she said without looking up. "This money, and the review. People are calling. A community center wants a mural. A small school wants art classes. That's wonderful," Robert said, leaning against the doorframe. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were filled with a new worry. "And you?" she asked softly. "I hear the phone. I see the news. This cost you." "The big deal." He waved a hand, trying to brush it away. "That was just a deal. This," he pointed to the statement, to the empty easel waiting for its next project. "This is real." She shook her head. "No, do not do that. Do not pretend for me. I know what I saw in those people's eyes at the gallery. I know what I see in yours now. It is not nothing. You lost something real, too." Her honesty pulled the truth from him. He came in and sat on the old stool. "I lost a version of myself, the one who only cared about the next win. And you know what? I'm glad he's gone. But it leaves a question. What do I do now? I can't just watch you paint forever." He tried to make it a joke, but it fell flat. They sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the ghosts of her paintings. "Now living in other people's homes, you have a talent, too," Ilara said suddenly. Robert gave a dry laugh. "For losing money? For seeing value," she corrected him. "You saw it in me when no one else did. Not even me. You saw it in Mike, and in Mr. Petrov. You know how to talk to people, to bring them together. That first day, with the coffee, you didn't ask about the cost of the paint. You asked about the eyes." She leaned forward. "That is your talent, so use it." The idea came slowly, over the next week. It wasn't a lightning bolt, but a dawn. They talked about it over meals, sketching it out on napkins like a business plan. But it was unlike any plan Robert had ever written. He used what was left of his capital, not to invest in steel or concrete, but in people. He found a large, sun-filled space in a neighborhood that wasn't trendy, but was full of life. It had big windows and scuffed floors. Ilara stood in the middle of the empty space one afternoon, the sun painting a stripe of gold on the floor. "This," she said, her voice full of awe. "This is it." 6 months later, the foundation for Seen Hands opened its doors. The name was Ilara's idea. On the left side of the space was a proper art studio, with easels and good light and shelves of supplies. It was a free classroom for adult immigrants, refugees, people who had left their old lives and skills behind. Ilara was the heart of it. She taught painting and drawing, but more than that, she taught people to remember who they were before the world labeled them. On the right side of the space was a small, neat office and a meeting area. This was Robert's side. He used his knowledge of business, of structure, of making things work, not for profit, but for support. He set up a microloan program, helping people start tiny businesses, a catering service, a repair shop, a tailoring business. He advised them, not as a distant benefactor, but as a partner who had also started with nothing. His clients were the spouses and relatives of Ilara's students, often. The foundation was a circle, one side feeding the other. Robert no longer wore suits. He wore simple shirts, and they sometimes got dirty. He learned to fix a leaking sink in the foundation's bathroom. He learned to unjam the ancient printer. He spent his days talking to a retired mechanic from Syria about business plans, and to a woman from Guatemala about marketing her beautiful woven textiles. One afternoon, a teenager, the son of one of Ilara's students, was hanging a new display of student artwork. He was struggling with a stubborn hook. Robert walked over. "Here," he said. "Let me hold that for you." He held the painting, a vibrant, chaotic scene of a marketplace, steady while the boy secured it. The boy stood back, nodding. "Looks good." "It does," Robert agreed, looking at the painting. It was full of life, imperfect and beautiful. Ilara approached, handing him a mug of coffee. "The new clay arrives tomorrow," she said. "The pottery teacher is excited." Robert took the coffee, smiling. "Good. We'll need to make space in the back." He looked around the bustling room. A group of women were laughing in the studio, mixing colors. 2 men were in his meeting area, bent over a spreadsheet. The space was filled with a noisy, warm, creative hum. It was the opposite of his old, quiet penthouse. It was alive. He was no longer a millionaire. Not in the old way. He had enough, but the frantic chase was over. The fortune he had now was in the faces around him. It was in the pride of the old tailor who had just paid back his first loan. It was in the light in Alara's eyes as she taught. He was richer. That evening, they walked back to the penthouse together, as they often did now. It was no longer his lonely fortress. It was just a place they lived, a quiet place to rest after the busy days. In a hallway, they passed the door to the studio, the room where it all began. It was still used, but now mostly for storage for the foundation. Robert paused, pushing the door open. The north light was the same, but the room was different. The easel was still there, but it was stacked with spare canvases. The walls were bare, waiting. It was a peaceful space now, a chapter that had been written. Alara stood beside him, looking in. "It feels like a different world," she said softly. "It was," Robert said. "It was the world where I was just a viewer, where you were just the help." He turned to her. "Thank you for showing me the door out," she smiled, a warm, tired, happy smile. "Thank you for opening it." They closed the door and walked down the hall to the kitchen to make dinner. Together, in the warm light of a home that was finally, truly, lived in. The story of the millionaire who came home early was over. In its place was a better, simpler, human story. The story of 2 friends who built something real, with their own hands.